Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. My name is Margaret Hayes. I am 68 years old. In one moment, I was struck with a broom by my daughter-in-law, and in the next, my own son laughed and told me not to call 911. That night, I realized I had given up everything, even sold my beloved bookstore, only to become invisible in their house. But when I found a hidden letter from my late husband and a small bookmark from my granddaughter that whispered, "I believe you," I knew this was not the end of my story. It was the night I began to take my power back. The ceramic mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the kitchen tile, the sound sharp and final in the quiet evening. I bent down instinctively, my knees stiff as always, reaching for the broken pieces. That was when I felt the jab against my shoulder, not a hand, but the hard end of a broom handle pressing into me, sudden and cold. I froze, my palms still hovering above the shards of porcelain. The sting spread through my arm, not enough to break the skin, but enough to humiliate. Erin stood above me, her face calm, her voice light as if she were speaking to a child. "Careful, Margaret," she said. "You could hurt yourself." She turned the broom in her hands as if nothing had happened, bristles pointing away wood against me. I stayed crouched longer than I needed to, staring at the floor, feeling the silence swell around us. My breath caught in the He watched us for a moment, then peeled it casually. "Don't call 911, Mom," he said with a small laugh, like he was talking about something ridiculous, something too minor to bother with. "It's just a broom. Don't make Erin upset." The words hit harder than the broom. I straightened slowly, my back stiff, pieces of the mug rattling in the dustpan I had picked up. I searched his face, hoping to see a flicker of concern, even a shadow of doubt, but his eyes slid away, focused on the fruit in his hand, as if I were no more than the clutter on the counter. I wanted to speak, to say that it wasn't about the broom or the mug, or even the pain it was about being treated like I did not matter. But the words stayed caught in my throat. Erin smiled, faintly satisfied with the order of things, and turned back toward the sink. I carried the broken pieces to the trash, my hand trembling slightly. The air smelled of lemon cleaner and detergent, too sharp, too sterile, like a house where warmth had been scrubbed out. My heart thudded so loudly I thought they must hear it. Travis bit into his banana and walked into the dining room, humming something off-key. Erin wiped the counter as if the mug had never existed, as if the moment had already been erased. I stood there holding the broom still, feeling the ghost of the wood against my skin. My chest ached, not from the strike, but from the hollow inside me. I thought of Alan, my husband, gone these past years, how he would have stood beside me, how he would have said my name with respect, even in anger. I thought of the bookstore we had built, Hayes. Books, the smell of paper and dust, and morning coffee, and how far away it felt now in this house that wasn't mine. Erin glanced at me briefly, her eyes cool, and then she returned to her phone buzzing on the counter. The screen lit up her face in blue light, indifferent and distant. I turned toward the stairs leading down to the basement, each step groaning under my weight. My hand brushed the railing smooth from years of use, and I thought of how many times I had steadied Travis on stairs just like these when he was a boy. He had clung to me then. Now he couldn't meet my eyes. In the basement, the air was damp, faint with mildew. My small lamp cast a weak glow over the mattress pushed against the wall. I sat down on the edge, broom still in my hand, and stared at the floor. The sound of their voices drifted faintly from above, light conversation, laughter, the clink of dishes. My world was quiet, a silence that pressed in on all sides. I laid the broom against the wall, tracing the ache in my shoulder with my fingertips. The bruise would fade, I knew, but something else had cracked something invisible, something that had taken years to build. I leaned back, eyes closed, letting the basement swallow me whole, and for the first time I wondered if I had made a mistake, selling the life I once had for the promise of family that now treated me like a shadow. I opened my eyes and stared at the stack of boxes pushed into the corner. Cardboard sagging at the edges, masking tape, yellowing with time. Inside were fragments of a different life, pieces of a woman who had once mattered. My fingers itched to reach for them, to touch the spine of a book I had once displayed proudly, to see Alan's handwriting on an old note. But my body felt heavy, pinned to the bed by more than age. Above me, the floorboards creaked. Aaron's voice rose in cheerful tones, telling Travis something about yoga schedules and Bella's homework. His laugh answered hers, light and easy. That laugh had once belonged to me, born from silly jokes I whispered when he was small, from stories I read to him late into the night. Hearing it now directed at her, used against me, cut sharper than any broom handle. I pressed my palms together in my lap, forcing my breath to steady. The basement smelled faintly of damp carpet and detergent, a mix that clung to my skin. I had said thank you when they offered me this room, had convinced myself it was temporary, a bridge between the life I ended and the one I had yet to start. But as I sat there, the sound of their laughter floating down through the vents, it felt less like a bridge and more like a cage. I traced the lines on my hand, remembering how these same fingers had once shelved books, counted change at the register, signed boxes of first editions for customers who believed my words meant something. Now those fingers shook faintly from the weight of a broom. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and let out a long breath. The room seemed smaller, the ceiling lower. My heart beat in my ears, steady and unforgiving. I knew the bruise would fade, the mug could be replaced, but what stayed was the image of Travis, my son, laughing as if my pain were nothing. That was the crack that spread quietly inside me, the one that would not heal with time. I reached for the small lamp, turning the knob until the light dimmed. Shadows stretched across the boxes, tall and thin, like silent witnesses to my shame. I whispered into the darkness, not to Aaron, not to Travis, but to the echo of Alan I still carried inside me. I whispered that I would not forget this night. The sound of a door closing upstairs drifted down, followed by silence. I laid back on the mattress, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling that separated me from the world above. My shoulder throbbed with every beat of my heart. I held my breath, waiting for the pain to settle, but it lingered steady and cold, a reminder that tonight something had broken that could never be put back together. The basement had its own kind of silence, heavier than the quiet upstairs, as if the air itself wanted me to forget that life was moving above me. The single lamp I had carried down from the attic cast a weak pool of light across the concrete floor. My mattress sagged against the wall, and a thin blanket barely kept out the damp that seeped through the cinder blocks. There were no windows, just one vent that carried down muffled noises from the kitchen. Sometimes laughter, sometimes footsteps, sometimes the hum of the refrigerator. Every night I folded my cardigan neatly at the edge of the bed, as if that small act of order might steady me. The smell of mildew lingered no matter how many times I sprayed the room with cleaner. Erin had called it cozy when she showed it to me, her smile rehearsed. Cozy was not the word. It was storage rearranged to look like hospitality. Plastic bins of holiday decorations lined one wall, and an old treadmill that had not worked in years leaned against the other. Upstairs, taped neatly to the refrigerator door, was Erin's list of house guidelines. I had found it on my first morning, typed and printed with bullet points. Quiet hours after 9. No reheating food with strong smells. No TV in shared spaces after dinner. Guests must clean immediately after use. The list ended with a cheerful, smiley face, as if politeness could soften the control behind every rule. I folded the paper and tucked it into my sweater pocket, carrying it like a reminder of my place. Sometimes I would climb upstairs early before Erin returned from teaching yoga classes just to pour a cup of coffee. I made sure to rinse the mug twice and place it back in the cabinet exactly where it had been. Travis would often pass me in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, already speaking before he looked at me. His words were rushed, filled with numbers and names from his insurance company in Hartford. He would smile absently, kiss the air near my cheek, and continue his call as if I were an afterthought. I told myself it was only temporary, that I was here to rest after selling the bookstore in Vermont. Hayes Books had been my world for 40 years. I remembered the feel of the wooden counter under my palms, the scent of old paper that clung to my clothes, the small bell above the door that chimed with every customer. When I locked the door for the last time in 2016, rain was falling softly on the sidewalk. I pressed my hand against the glass longer than I meant to, not ready to walk away. Now I was in a room without windows, trying to build a life inside someone else's rules. I often traced the ridges of an old bookmark Alan had given me years ago, the edges frayed, the ink fading. He had told me once that home was not a place but a rhythm, something you carried. I tried to believe that, but the rhythm was gone. One afternoon I climbed the stairs quietly, hoping for a moment of sunlight through the kitchen window. The refrigerator hummed and the guidelines fluttered slightly from the air vent. I poured water into the kettle and leaned against the counter, listening. That was when I heard Travis's voice low in the dining room. "No, she hasn't signed anything yet," he was saying. His tone was calm but carried a thread of irritation. "I will take care of it soon, don't worry." I froze, one hand gripping the edge of the counter. Papers rustled on the table and I heard the scrape of a chair. "Yes, Mom hasn't updated anything. But she will. I'll make sure." The words slipped into me like ice. He was talking about me not just as a mother, but as a responsibility to be managed. My name, my choices, reduced to paperwork he would fix. I waited until the front door closed behind him before I let myself move again. The kettle whistled sharply. I turned it off and stood still, the steam clouding the air. My reflection in the kitchen window looked unfamiliar, thinner, smaller. For a moment I saw myself back in the bookstore, shelves rising behind me, customers waiting for my recommendations. My name had meant something then. Erin arrived a few minutes later, her gym bag slung over her shoulder. She glanced at the cup of tea in my hand, then at the spotless counter. "You know the rules about strong smells," she said lightly. "Just keep it simple." She walked past me without waiting for a reply. Back in the basement, I sat on the edge of the bed, the tea cooling in my hands. The vent carried down their voices, Erin's bright and clear, Travis's lower, steady talking again about forms and documents. I set the cup on the nightstand and pressed my palms together. It was only a sentence, maybe one he thought I would never hear. But it told me everything. My place in this house was not as mother or guest. I was an obligation, a signature they were waiting for a task to be completed. The ache in my chest spread heavier than the damp in the walls. I closed my eyes and listened to the faint sound of Bella's laughter upstairs, her voice high and unguarded. For her, I smiled in silence, though no one could see. That laugh was the only reminder that some part of me still mattered. The basement settled around me as the evening came, shadows stretching across the bins of decorations, the treadmill gathering dust. I leaned back against the mattress and let the darkness grow. For the first time, I wondered what exactly Travis meant by soon, and what would happen when soon finally arrived. Equal sign, 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 equal sign. I could not shake the sound of Travis's voice from my head, the way he had said it so casually, as if I were a line item on a checklist. That night, I lay awake in the basement, the hum of the heater switching on and off, and every time I drifted close to sleep, the words came back to me. She hasn't signed anything yet. She will. I'll make sure. The next morning, I decided to straighten the boxes stacked against the wall. My joints protested as I pulled one heavy carton forward, dust rising in the still air. The tape peeled away with a brittle crack. Inside were books wrapped in old newspaper, the edges yellowing. I lifted a volume and brushed it clean, the smell of paper bringing back the years I had spent surrounded by shelves and customers, and the rhythm of a life that had once belonged to me. Beneath the books was a shoebox, the lid sagging. I set it on the mattress and opened it carefully. Old photographs spilled out black and white snapshots of Alan holding Travis as a baby, my own younger face smiling stiffly at the camera. I pressed one photo to my chest, remembering the feel of Alan's hand warm against mine, the certainty of his presence. At the bottom of the box, folded neatly though the edges had begun to curl, was an envelope. My name was written in Alan's handwriting, the letters shaky but unmistakable. My throat tightened as I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a single page lined and slightly faded. Margaret, if I go first, do not keep living only for others. You gave me everything. Promise me you will take what is left of your story and make it your own. Write it as if no one else can decide for you. I love you always, Alan. The words blurred as my eyes filled. I sat on the mattress, clutching the page, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. He had written it years before after his first stroke, and hidden it away where he knew I would one day find it. My tears fell onto the paper, dark spots, spreading across his careful script. I closed my eyes and remembered the hospital room, the beeping machines, the way his hand had felt so fragile in mine. I had promised then that I would be fine, that I would keep living. But what had I done since I had sold our bookstore, the place where he had spent weekends fixing shelves, where we had raised Travis among towers of novels and stacks of poetry? I had given up the space that held our laughter, our grief, our shared beginnings, and now I was here in a windowless basement, treated like a guest on probation. I held the letter close, reading it again and again, until the words etched themselves into me. He had asked me not to shrink, not to disappear. Yet every day under Aaron's watchful eyes, I had folded myself smaller, trying not to cause offense, trying to stay quiet. The basement door creaked and Bella's voice floated down. "Grandma, are you awake?" I wiped my eyes quickly and folded the letter back into the envelope. "Yes, sweetheart, come down." She patted down the stairs in her socks, carrying a school folder in her arms. "Mom says I have to finish this essay tonight," she said, "but I don't know how to start." I smiled, forcing steadiness into my voice. "Sit here," I told her, patting the mattress beside me. "Let's look at it together." She sat close, her hair brushing my shoulder, and I guided her through the first lines. My mind wandered as she wrote, but my hand rested on the envelope beneath the blanket, as if keeping contact with Alan's words would anchor me. When she finished her draft, she looked up at me with those clear brown eyes. "Thanks, Grandma," she whispered. "You always make it easier." After she left, I unfolded the letter again. The silence of the basement wrapped around me, but this time it felt less empty. Alan's voice echoed in my head, urging me to remember who I was. That evening at dinner, Erin reminded me of the rules again. She wrinkled her nose at the scent of the stew I had reheated, saying it lingered too long in the kitchen. Travis barely looked up from his phone. I nodded, swallowing my words, but the envelope in my cardigan pocket felt heavy against my side. Later, when I lay down on the mattress, I pulled it out once more. The lamp cast a circle of light over the page. I traced the letters of his name with my finger. Alan. My partner, my compass. He had left me with more than memories. He had left me with a command quiet but unyielding. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the shoebox, tucking the box under the bed where I could reach it whenever I needed to. My hands still shook, but not only from grief. Something else stirred beneath the weight of sorrow, a pulse of defiance I had not felt in years. Above me, the house settled into its nightly rhythm, the sound of dishes being put away, Erin's laughter carrying faintly through the vent. I turned off the lamp and lay in the darkness, holding Alan's words inside me. For the first time since I had moved into this house, I did not feel entirely powerless. I had a voice still hidden but waiting, and Alan had reminded me that it was mine to use. It happened on a Tuesday evening while the sky outside was dimming into the gray of early winter. I had been sweeping crumbs from the kitchen floor after Bella dropped a handful of crackers. My grip on the broom loosened for a moment and the handle slipped sideways. Erin was suddenly there, quicker than I expected, yanking it from my hand. The wood struck against my wrist in one sharp motion. A dull ache spread, instantly stinging as if the bones themselves were offended. I did not cry out. I stood frozen, my fingers tingling. Erin's voice was light, almost casual. "It is dangerous when you wave things around like that. You are lucky Bella was not nearby." She placed the broom against the counter as though she had done nothing more than straighten a chair. Then she walked away, humming to herself. The sound of footsteps drifted above as Travis excused himself with the usual yawn and the excuse of catching up on work emails. He had not even looked at me before disappearing upstairs. My hand throbbed in the silence he left behind. I lowered myself into the breakfast nook, staring at the pale tiles beneath my feet. The kitchen lights glared too brightly, showing every wrinkle in my hands, every mark of time. Erin's voice floated in from the hallway, calling Bella to help with laundry. Her tone was cheerful, pleasant, the kind she used for neighbors and strangers. It was the kind of voice that erased what had just happened, painting over it with something smooth and false. I stayed seated longer than I should have, listening to the distant sounds of drawers opening, fabric shifting. My wrist pulsed, each beat a reminder. Finally, I rose and moved slowly toward the stairs. The basement door creaked when I opened it, a familiar sound that marked the line between their world and mine. I carried the ache with me as I descended into the damp quiet. Later, when the house had settled into its nighttime rhythm, I heard the faintest shuffle outside my door. It was cautious, hesitant, the sound of small feet pausing on each step. The knob turned and the door opened just enough for Bella's face to appear, her hair tangled from sleep. She held a small plastic box against her chest. "Grandma?" she whispered. "Can I come in?" I nodded and she slipped inside, closing the door gently behind her. She set the box on the mattress and opened it, revealing a handful of bandages and a cold compress. Without a word, she took my hand and examined the swelling at my wrist. Her little brows furrowed the way Alan's had when he concentrated. "You did not do anything wrong," she said softly, her voice steady though her eyes shimmered. She pressed the cold pack carefully against my skin, wrapping a cloth around it with slow determination. I watched her bite her lip the way she always did when she was focused. "I know," I whispered back. For a moment we sat in silence, her small hands against mine, her presence filling the basement with something warmer than the lamp could provide. She placed the pack securely and looked up at me again. Her eyes did not waver, and in them I saw something pure, something unbroken. She closed the box and stood. I thought she might hug me, but instead she reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a folded slip of paper. She placed it in my lap. I waited until she had climbed halfway up the stairs before I unfolded it. The paper was lined from a school notebook, the handwriting uneven but careful. Across the top, she had written 3 words: "I believe you." I held it in both hands, reading the letters over and over. The ache in my wrist seemed to fade beneath the weight of those words. Tears pricked my eyes but did not fall. I slipped the paper into the cardigan I wore most days close to my chest. Bella's footsteps disappeared above, and the house returned to its ordinary hum. Yet the basement felt different, as if her note had changed the air itself. For the first time since I had come to this house, I did not feel entirely alone. I lay down on the mattress, the paper pressing softly against me. My eyes traced the shadows on the ceiling, long and shifting with the lamp's glow. The bruise on my wrist would remain a mark of silence and dismissal. But in my pocket I carried something stronger, a message written in a child's hand that told me I still mattered. Upstairs, Erin laughed at something Travis said, her voice smooth and easy. I turned my head into the pillow and closed my eyes, letting Bella's words echo quietly until sleep finally came. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual. The table was set neatly, the silverware aligned, just so Erin's touch in every detail. Bella sat across from me, her fork tapping against the rim of her plate as she tried to balance a piece of broccoli. Travis had already poured himself a glass of wine, swirling it like a man easing into comfort after a long day. I kept my eyes on the roast chicken, focusing on carving it into smaller pieces, pretending the silence was ordinary. Halfway through the meal, Erin cleared her throat and reached down beside her chair. When she straightened, she placed a thick folder on the table. The sound of it landing between the serving dishes was heavier than it should have been. She smoothed her hand across the cover and looked at me with that bright smile of hers, the one she used when speaking to clients or neighbors. "Margaret," she began, "I think it would really help if we got some things settled." Her tone was pleasant, almost rehearsed. "These are just standard documents, power of attorney forms, medical directives, and a few updates for your will. Nothing urgent, but it would make everything simpler down the road." My fork paused in midair. The chicken on my plate cooled as her words pressed into me. I felt Travis shift beside her, leaning back in his chair with the ease of someone who had already agreed. "Mom," he added, his voice casual, "you should sign them. That way Bella and we won't have to deal with a mess later. It's just common sense." I laid my fork down carefully, the clink against the porcelain louder than I expected. My chest tightened, my breath slow. I glanced at Bella. She had stopped eating, her small eyes moving between us, confusion shadowing her face. Erin flipped open the folder, sliding a pen neatly on top of the pages. Her nails clicked softly against the table as she tapped the pen into place. "Just a signature here and there," she said, still smiling. "It will take no more than 10 minutes. I folded my hands in my lap, pressing them together until my knuckles whitened. The air in the dining room felt thinner pressing against me. I thought of Alan's letter hidden safely in my room, his words urging me to live for myself. I thought of the bookstore, the decades of work, the shelves that carried not just books, but my name, my pride. And here I was, expected to give away the last threads of my independence between bites of dinner. Travis took another sip of wine. "Mom," he said, "don't make this harder than it has to be." Bella's fork slipped and clattered onto her plate. Erin reached over quickly, steadying her glass of water, but her eyes never left me. I forced a smile, one I did not feel, and shook my head gently. "Not tonight," I said, my voice low but steady. Erin's smile thinned, but she closed the folder with a careful pat, as if she had expected resistance, but was confident it would not last. "Of course," she said smoothly, "whenever you are ready." The rest of dinner passed with small talk about school projects and Travis's workload. I nodded at the right times, pushed food around my plate, and kept my eyes on Bella when I needed strength. She held her napkin in her lap, folding and unfolding it, her shoulders tense, though she said nothing. When the dishes were cleared, Travis disappeared into his office, muttering about emails. Erin stacked the plates, humming to herself, her movements precise. The folder remained on the corner of the table, its presence louder than any words. I carried myself downstairs slowly, each step deliberate, the envelope of Alan's letter pressing against my chest beneath my cardigan. In the basement, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence cover me. My wrists still ached faintly from the broom days before, but this new weight was heavier. It was not just a bruise or a broken mug. It was my life reduced to lines on a page waiting for a signature. I pulled the cardigan tighter and reached into the pocket where Bella's small note rested. "I believe you." The words steadied me, though my body trembled. I knew then that every smile Erin offered was a step. Every glass of wine Travis sipped was a delay. Every conversation at the table was one more push toward erasing me. Upstairs, I heard the faint scrape of chairs and the murmur of voices. I pressed the paper to my lips and closed my eyes. The basement was cold, but inside me, something warmer sparked, fragile but real. It was the knowledge that I saw them clearly now, their intentions, their pressure disguised as care. I placed Bella's note beside Alan's letter on the nightstand, two fragile anchors in a storm that was only beginning. The hum of the heater filled the room, steady and mechanical, as I sat quietly and gathered what little strength I had left for whatever was coming next. The next morning, the sun filtered weakly through the kitchen window, lighting the frost on the grass outside. I carried a basket of laundry to the back porch, hoping the air might clear the heaviness from the night before. The chill bit into my fingers as I clipped a sheet onto the line. That was when I saw Mrs. Carter standing at the edge of her driveway, pulling weeds from the small strip of earth that bordered her fence. She had always been polite in passing a gentle nod or a wave when we crossed paths. I raised my hand, forcing a smile. "Good morning," I called. The sheet flapped between us, white against the pale sky. She straightened slowly and looked at me with an expression I did not recognize. Her eyes were cool, her lips pressed thin. She paused as though debating whether to respond at all. Finally, she said, "You're doing all right then. Her voice was smooth, but carried a sharpness beneath it. Just be careful not to break any more dishes. I blinked, the clothespin slipping from my hand. The sheet sagged against the line. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the answer settled in me before I could speak. Erin's voice echoed from the night before, cheerful and practiced the way she recited guidelines and smiled through clenched teeth. I knew then that whatever had been whispered inside these walls had found its way beyond them. Mrs. Carter bent back to her weeds, dismissing me with her silence. I finished hanging the sheet with numb hands, my chest tight. When I stepped back into the kitchen, Erin was at the counter stirring sugar into her tea. She looked up and smiled, too wide, too bright. "Did you have a nice chat with Evelyn?" she asked. Her use of Mrs. Carter's first name was deliberate, a reminder that she belonged to the circle of neighborhood women, while I was the outsider. I set the basket down quietly and nodded. She did not need my words to know what had been exchanged at the fence. Bella wandered in, still in her pajamas, her hair tangled from sleep. She hugged me around the waist before reaching for a bowl from the cupboard. Erin's smile softened, only for her daughter. "Remember to finish your book report tonight," she said. Then she glanced at me again, her eyes cold behind the brightness. Later that day, I walked to the mailbox at the end of the street. The air was crisp, my breath visible. A car slowed as it passed, the driver glancing at me longer than seemed necessary. I could feel the weight of their curiosity, the way gossip clung faster than truth. I held the stack of envelopes tightly, though most were junk, my name printed in bold letters above this address that was not mine. When I returned to the porch, Erin was there, watering the small row of potted plants she had arranged like a stage set. She tilted her head toward me. "You know," she said lightly, "people around here notice things. They talk. It's easier if we keep everything looking orderly." I wanted to ask what stories she had told, what details she had twisted. Instead, I carried the mail inside my shoulders, stiff, my silence once again taken as agreement. That evening, while preparing dinner, I dropped a spoon on the tile. The clang rang louder than it should have. Erin appeared almost instantly from the dining room doorway. "Careful," she said, her tone dripping with false concern. "We wouldn't want another accident." Travis looked up from his phone, smirked faintly, then returned to scrolling. The spoon lay at my feet harmless, but my cheeks burned as though I had committed some terrible mistake. I bent slowly to pick it up, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Later, I heard the doorbell ring. Through the vent in the basement, I caught fragments of conversation, Erin's laugh, Mrs. Carter's voice replying. The words blurred, but the tone was unmistakable. They were sharing a story, one that did not belong to Erin, but had been handed to her to reshape, to distribute. My name became the punchline. I sat on the mattress, hands pressed against my knees, and let the voices wash over me. The basement smelled of damp carpet, the walls cool against my back. Alan's letter rested in the shoebox beneath the bed, and Bella's note was tucked safely in my pocket. I touched the paper through the fabric, grounding myself. When the voices faded and the door closed upstairs, I climbed the stairs slowly, needing water. Erin was wiping the counter, her movements precise, her smile already in place. Mrs. Carter's perfume still lingered faintly in the air. Erin looked at me and tilted her head. "People worry about you, Margaret," she said sweetly. "They want to know you're managing." My throat tightened. I poured a glass of water, hands steady though my chest ached. Bella appeared in the doorway, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She looked between us, her eyes questioning. Erin touched her shoulder gently and said it was bedtime. I returned to the basement and sat in the dark, the glass empty beside me. The bruise on my wrist was fading, but the sting of Aaron's words lived in every glance from the neighbors, every polite smile that held a shadow of doubt. I closed my eyes and pressed both hands to the shoebox, holding on to Alan's handwriting, to Bella's small declaration of faith. For the first time, I understood that Aaron's reach did not end at the kitchen table. She was painting me weak and clumsy in the eyes of the very people who might have been my refuge. I felt the weight of their judgment before I ever heard their words. And in that moment, sitting in the basement with only shadows for company, I realized I was no longer just being silenced inside the house. I was being erased outside of it, too. The house was quiet that night, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest until you cannot tell if it is the walls or your own heart that weighs more. I sat on the edge of the mattress in the basement, staring at the faint outline of boxes stacked against the far wall. The lamp flickered once its bulb tired the yellow glow, barely reaching beyond my knees. I felt the sting of the bruise on my wrist fading, but still tender, and beneath it all was the sharper wound of humiliation, the kind that lingers long after skin has healed. The voices of neighbors still clung to my ears. The look on Mrs. Carter's face earlier that morning had told me more than words could. Aaron's lies had taken root outside these walls. I was no longer just the old woman in the basement. I had become the story of weakness, clumsiness, pity. She had spread her version of me into the world, and people were willing to believe it. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the cool wall. For weeks I had let their rules shape me, let silence cover me like a blanket. But that night, something inside refused to stay folded any longer. I reached under the bed and pulled out the shoebox. The cardboard rasped against the concrete floor as I set it on my lap. My hands trembled, but I lifted the lid anyway. Alan's envelope lay on top as if it had been waiting for me. I traced the shaky letters of my name written in his hand, my throat tight. Slowly I unfolded the page. The paper was soft from being handled, the ink slightly blurred. His voice came alive in every line. Do not live for their comfort. Take what is left of your story and make it your own. I held the letter against my chest, closing my eyes. Alan had known me better than anyone. He had known that I would give until nothing was left, and then for the people I loved, even as they pressed me into silence. His words were not a request. They were a command. I set the letter down gently and reached for the slip of paper folded in my cardigan pocket. Bella's handwriting stared back at me, the pencil uneven but steady. I believe you. The 3 words glowed brighter than the lamp, brighter than any comfort I had allowed myself. She was only 11, but she had seen enough. She knew the truth even when her father chose not to. I pressed both notes together, Alan's and Bella's, and whispered into the stillness. Tonight. I rose and pulled the old suitcase from the closet. Its zipper screeched open, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I laid it flat on the floor and began placing clothes inside, folding each one with deliberate care. A blouse Alan had once complimented, a cardigan Bella had curled into during a storm, the sturdy shoes I had worn in the bookstore every morning. These were not just clothes. They were pieces of myself, reminders of a woman who had lived beyond basements and rules. I turned toward the stack of boxes near the furnace. One was marked documents in Alan's neat hand. I dragged it closer, coughing as dust rose. Inside were folders of bank statements, the deed from our bookstore in Vermont, old tax papers. I pulled them out, spreading them across the bed. Erin's voice echoed in my mind, smooth and convincing, asking me to sign away my authority for convenience. Travis's voice followed, telling me not to make things harder. I found the small portable copier I had kept from the store tucked inside a crate of office supplies. My fingers shook as I plugged it into the wall, not from weakness, but from resolve. The machine hummed louder than I remembered, but it worked. Page after page slid out warm and fresh, my name repeated, my history preserved. I gathered the copies and slipped them into a manila envelope. I wrote my name across the front in bold letters, underlining it twice. The sound of footsteps above froze me in place. I held my breath until they faded down the hallway. Then I continued sliding the envelope into the suitcase, tucking it between layers of clothes where no one would see. I sat back on the bed, the papers surrounding me, the lamp flickering weakly. My chest rose and fell steady now, stronger than before. For months I had let them define me, let their version of me spread through whispers and polite nods. But tonight I had written a different line. It was not ink on paper. It was decision in motion. I folded Alan's letter and Bella's note into a smaller envelope, sealing it with a strip of tape. I pressed it against my lips, closing my eyes. Those words were not for anyone else. They were for me, the only inheritance I truly needed. I placed the envelope into the side pocket of the suitcase, close enough to reach with one hand. Midnight passed quietly, the clock ticking steadily on the nightstand. I zipped the suitcase, the sound final and loud in the small room. I stood and looked around at the basement, the damp carpet, the peeling paint on the walls. This had been my cage, but it would not be my end. I pressed my hand against the handle of the suitcase and whispered into the air, steady and certain. Tonight, I take my power back. The lamp dimmed once more, then steadied. I turned it off and let the darkness cover the room. My suitcase stood by the door ready. I lay down on the mattress without changing Alan's letter and Bella's note under my pillow. The pipes groaned above me, water running through their veins, and I felt my own pulse echo with them. Sleep came slowly, but not from exhaustion. It came like the calm before movement, the silence before the first step. I knew the path would not be easy. I knew Erin's lies would not fade quickly, and Travis's silence would cut deeper before it healed. But for the first time in months, I did not feel erased. I closed my eyes and held the edges of the pillow tight. The suitcase waited at the door, the copies safe inside, the words of Alan and Bella pressed close against my heart. In that moment, in the stillness of a basement that had been meant to break me, I knew I was already gone. My story was no longer theirs to tell. It was mine again. The night bled slowly into gray, the kind of half-light that belongs neither to evening nor morning. I rose from the mattress, fully dressed, my cardigan buttoned to the top, the suitcase waiting by the door. The house above me was still only the faint hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence. I placed Alan's letter and Bella's note into the inner pocket of my coat, feeling their weight against my chest. My hand shook as I reached for the suitcase handle. The metal scraped softly against the floor when I pulled it upright. I winced at the sound and paused, listening. Nothing stirred upstairs. The air was cold and damp, my breath visible in the beam of the lamp. I turned it off and stepped into the stairwell. Each creak of the wooden stairs seemed too loud. I moved slowly, pressing my hand against the railing, willing it to stay quiet. The hallway was dim, the curtains drawn, the world beyond still asleep. My heart pounded harder than it had in years, not from fear, but from the certainty of leaving. I was almost to the back door when I saw her. Bella stood at the end of the hallway wrapped in her fuzzy robe, her hair tangled from sleep. She held something in her hand, her eyes wide but calm. She did not ask where I was going. She only stepped closer and opened her palm. It was the same bookmark she had given me days before the edges bent the pencil letters faint but clear. I believe you. She placed it in my hand, pressing my fingers around it. For a moment the hallway felt suspended, the world outside waiting, while the two of us breathed in the same silence. She wrapped her arms around me, fiercely surprising me with her strength. Her face pressed against my chest, her heartbeat quick against mine. I held her tightly, memorizing the feel of her small shoulders, the warmth of her. When she pulled back, she did not speak. She only nodded her eyes, telling me everything words could not. I cupped her cheek briefly, my throat too tight to manage sound. Then she stepped back toward her room, her small figure swallowed by the shadows of the hallway. I watched until her door closed softly. I turned and opened the back door, the cold air rushing in. The suitcase wheels bumped softly over the threshold and onto the concrete path. The grass was wet with frost, glittering faintly under the street lamp. I closed the door behind me without looking back. The street was empty. The sky was beginning to pale, streaks of pink brushing against the horizon. I pulled the suitcase along the cracked sidewalk, the wheels whispering against the concrete. The houses on either side were dark curtains drawn tight. At the corner, I paused and looked back. The house loomed against the faint light, silent and ordinary, no different from the others around it. Yet inside were the pieces of myself I refused to leave behind. For a moment, I let my eyes rest on the upstairs window, imagining Bella lying in her bed, awake, listening. I whispered thank you into the morning air, not to the house, but to the child who had given me courage. Then I turned my back and kept walking. The bus stop was 2 blocks away. My breath came out in white clouds, the suitcase thumping softly with each step. I remembered the mornings at Hayes Books, when I unlocked the door just as the sun rose, the smell of coffee drifting from the cafe down the street, the promise of a day that belonged to me. This morning felt like that again. A beginning. When I reached the stop, the bench was cold, the metal damp beneath me. I set the suitcase at my feet and pulled my coat tighter. The street was quiet, only the sound of a distant car engine breaking the stillness. I placed my hand over the pocket where Alan's letter and Bella's bookmark rested. The sky grew lighter, the frost beginning to fade. My fingers stopped trembling. I lifted my head and looked down the road where the bus would come. The house behind me was already shrinking in memory, a place I would not return to. The rumble of the bus arrived faintly at first, then louder, steady, certain. I rose, gripped the suitcase handle, and stepped closer to the curb. The air smelled of cold earth and damp leaves, but beneath it all was something sharper, cleaner, the scent of freedom. As the bus pulled up, doors opening with a hiss, I took one last breath of the morning air. I did not glance back again. My hand tightened around the suitcase, and I stepped forward into the space that waited for me, carrying nothing but my past in a pocket and the certainty of a future that was finally my own. The bus ride north carried me through long stretches of bare trees and quiet towns still wrapped in sleep. My suitcase rested beside me, the hum of the engine steady like a heartbeat. I watched frost melt into rivulets across the window as the miles passed, each one pulling me farther from Hartford and closer to Burlington. The closer we came, the more I felt the pull of something waiting, something I had almost buried with the keys I turned over years ago. When the bus pulled into the station, the morning sun had climbed high enough to warm the pavement. I stepped onto the sidewalk, gripping the suitcase handle tightly. The streets were familiar, the rhythm of cars and the smell of lake air mingling with the memory of my own footsteps. I walked slowly through downtown Burlington past the bakery where Alan used to buy maple scones, past the cafe that had once displayed stacks of my books in their window. Each landmark was a whisper of a life I had thought I had closed. Finally, I stood before the storefront. The awning was faded, the name Hayes Books barely visible through the peeling paint, but it was still there. My hand trembled as I reached out, brushing dust from the glass door. The lock clicked easily when I tried the old key I had carried like a relic all these years. I pushed the door open, and the smell of paper and wood rushed over me, thick with dust but unmistakable. Inside, the shelves still stood empty but familiar, their surfaces coated in a fine gray layer. Light filtered through blinds that had not been adjusted in years, casting long bars across the floor. I set my suitcase by the entrance and walked deeper into the room. My fingers traced the edges of the nearest shelf, the grooves Alan had carved when he repaired it one winter. The wood was rough but solid, carrying both our laughter and our arguments. I whispered to the silence, "This is where I begin." The dust clung to my skin as I wiped a shelf with my sleeve. I found an old rag near the counter and began to sweep it across the wood, revealing the warm grain beneath. Each stroke felt like reclaiming a part of myself. The rhythm of cleaning returned to me easily, like opening a book I had read 100 times before. I moved from shelf to shelf, dragging the rag along, coughing as clouds of dust filled the air. Behind the counter, I found the register unplugged but intact. A stack of forgotten receipts lay beside it, their ink faded but still legible. Names of customers, titles of books I had recommended, dates from years when my life had felt full. I touched them gently before gathering them into a pile. In the back office, the air was colder, the light weaker. Boxes lined the walls, some collapsed from moisture. I lifted the flaps of one and found flyers for an author event from 2013, the bold letters announcing readings and signings. Beneath them was a stack of old mail unopened envelopes with my name printed clearly. I sifted through until my hand struck something harder. It was a frame, the glass cracked, but the paper inside intact. I wiped it clean with the edge of my cardigan and stared at the words. Business license, Hayes Books, issued to Margaret Hayes. The date was almost a lifetime ago, but the seal still glimmered faintly under the dust. My throat tightened. I sat down on the old stool by the desk and held the frame against my chest. It was not just a piece of paper. It was proof that once I had built something lasting, something of my own. Aaron could smear my name in Hartford. Travis could try to strip me of rights. But here was a document issued by the state of Vermont declaring that I had created, that I had owned, that I had mattered. I placed the license on the desk, clearing space around it. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight that managed to sneak through the blinds. My hands shook as I traced the letters of my name, steadying myself with each stroke. The room around me was still in disarray, boxes, slumped shelves empty, but my chest felt lighter than it had in months. The license was more than memory. It was a beginning waiting to be claimed again. I rose, pulling the blinds higher to let light pour in. Dust scattered through the air, glittering like fragments of something breaking open. I dragged the suitcase into the office and opened it, pulling out the envelope of copies I had made in the basement. I set it next to the license, my name on both one from the past and one for the future. The floor creaked as I walked back to the front of the shop. I unlocked the side windows, forcing them open until the air rushed in crisp and clean from Lake Champlain. The smell of damp wood was carried out, replaced with the scent of the city morning. I leaned against the counter and let the light fall across me. This was not the same store I had left. The paint peeled, the floors scuffed, but beneath it was the same heartbeat. I could hear it in the echo of my footsteps, in the memory of customers laughing between the shelves, in Alan's voice telling me to keep going. I stood in the middle of the shop, hands on the counter, and breathed deeply. The dust would take days to clear the shelves, weeks to fill, but the foundation was here waiting for me. I whispered again, steadier this time. I will start from here. The words settled into the air like a vow, unshaken by dust or time. I picked up the rag again, rolling up my sleeves, and went back to work. The days that followed were filled with dust and silence, but beneath the stillness there was a rhythm, building something that felt like the heartbeat of a new beginning. I cleaned the shelves until my arms ached, opened the blinds to let the Vermont sunlight pour across the floorboards, and brewed coffee on a small hot plate I had found in the back office. One morning, as I sat at the counter with Alan's letter tucked safely in my pocket, I realized I did not want to rebuild Hayes' books exactly as it had been. What I wanted was a place where women like me could step in and feel less alone. I reached out to an old acquaintance, Leanne Park, a lawyer who had once advised me years ago when I nearly sold the bookstore. Her voice on the phone was warm but steady, carrying the same mix of compassion and firmness I remembered. When I told her what I envisioned, she did not hesitate. She drove to Burlington 2 days later, sitting across from me at a folding table in the shop with her legal pad open, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. "You need more than a clean space, Margaret," she said, tapping her pen against the page. "You need structure, something that will last beyond the walls of this shop. A foundation." The word startled me at first. Foundation sounded too grand, too heavy for someone who had been living in a basement not long ago. But as she spoke, outlining what it would take to create a nonprofit to secure resources to gather women, the weight began to feel like possibility. We chose a name together, though I knew it the moment it passed through my lips. The Second Chapter Foundation. Leanne smiled at the phrase, nodding as if she had been waiting for me to say it. The first meeting was held on a chilly evening in October of 2019. The leaves outside were gold and red, drifting against the windows of the shop. I had cleared the shelves and set up a circle of mismatched chairs borrowed from a church down the street. A pot of coffee simmered on the hot plate, its steam curling through the air. I sat at the counter waiting, unsure if anyone would come. Angela arrived first. She was in her 70s, her hair cut short, her hands restless as she gripped a worn handbag. She sat heavily in one of the chairs, her eyes darting around the empty shelves. "My son took my pension," she said abruptly, her voice flat. "Signed me onto his account and drained it. Now I rent a couch from a friend." She folded her hands in her lap, staring at the floor, as if daring someone to tell her she was wrong. Next came Maria, younger, perhaps in her 50s, her face lined not just from time, but from exhaustion. She told us how her daughter-in-law scolded her daily, how she cooked and cleaned, but was called useless anyway. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her sleeve, her voice cracking with every word. Then there was Unji, quiet and hesitant, her English halting. She carried her purse tightly in her lap as if it might vanish if she let go. Through broken phrases, she told us she had left Korea to live with her son, how he forbade her from visiting her sister in Chicago, how she was never allowed out of the house without permission. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she spoke, and her shoulders shook with the weight of years of silence. The air in the room grew heavy. each story layered on top of the last, filling the space with pain that seemed too much for one room to hold. For a moment, none of us spoke. The sound of the coffee maker burbling was the only noise absurdly loud against the hush of sorrow. Then Angela lifted her head. She looked at Maria, then at Unji, and she gave a small nod. "Me too," she said simply. Maria's lips trembled, then she reached across the space and touched Angela's hand. Unji followed, her fingers shaking, but steady enough to join. I watched as their hands linked, as something passed between them that was heavier than grief and lighter than air. It was recognition. For months I had carried my pain like it was a solitary punishment, something that made me invisible. In that moment, I understood I was part of something larger, a pattern of stories that stretched far beyond my own basement. My chest tightened with both sadness and relief. This was what the second chapter foundation would be. Not charity, not pity, but a place where the truth could be spoken aloud, where silence would no longer erase us. I leaned forward, resting my hands on my knees, and told them what Alan had written to me. Do not live for their comfort. Take what is left of your story and make it your own. The words hung in the air, simple but unyielding. Angela nodded again, tears slipping down her face. Maria let out a shaky laugh, the first sound of lightness that evening. Unji whispered thank you in a voice so soft I almost missed it. We sat there for hours, drinking coffee that grew bitter as it cooled, telling pieces of our lives in uneven turns. The shelves around us were bare, but the room was fuller than it had been in years. When the women left, their shoulders were still bent, but their steps were lighter. After the last chair was pushed back against the wall, I locked the door and stood in the quiet shop. The business license hung on the wall, now cleaned and framed again, a reminder of who I had been. The foundation papers Leanne had drawn up lay on the counter waiting for my signature. I looked at the empty shelves, the worn floorboards, the circle of chairs, and I felt the strength of something beginning. This was no longer Hayes Books. It was the second chapter foundation. And it was no longer only my story. It was ours. In early spring of 2020, the phone rang in the office at the back of the shop. I almost let it go to voicemail, thinking it was another wrong number, but something made me answer. A clear voice introduced herself as Amanda Lee, a producer for a community affairs program out of Burlington. She explained that she had heard whispers about the Second Chapter Foundation through a colleague who attended one of our early meetings. She wanted to feature our work on her show if I was comfortable. My hands tightened on the receiver. The thought of cameras unsettled me, but Amanda's tone carried no pressure. She promised it could be filmed quietly with dignity, with the focus on the women who chose to speak. I agreed on one condition: that my name would not be splashed across the screen, that the story would belong to the voices, not the spectacle. Amanda understood. 2 weeks later, a small crew arrived with lights and microphones. They filmed us sitting in our circle of chairs, steam rising from the coffee pot, women clutching notebooks and tissues. Angela spoke haltingly about losing her pension, her voice breaking only once. Maria lifted her chin as she described the words that had been thrown at her daily by her daughter-in-law. Unji, with the help of a translator, spoke softly of the loneliness she carried each day in a country that still felt foreign. I did not tell them what to say. I only sat among them, adding pieces of my own story when the silence felt too heavy. I spoke of the basement, of rules taped to refrigerators, of the sound of a broomstick against bone. The room grew so still that even the hum of the camera equipment seemed distant. When the program aired on a Thursday evening, I did not watch. I sat in the shop closing up for the night, the license still gleaming faintly on the wall, but my phone began buzzing almost immediately. Women left messages, voices trembling, telling me they had thought they were alone. Some cried, some whispered thank you over and over. By the weekend, the foundation had more calls than we could answer. Meanwhile, in Hartford, Erin saw the broadcast on her own television. A neighbor had texted her the time, curious to know if the woman on the screen was truly her mother-in-law. Erin's face burned as she watched, her jaw tightening with every sentence that carried a trace of her household. She paced the living room, muttering that I was trying to make them look like monsters. Travis sat on the couch, remote in his hand, staring at the screen. He said little, only shifting uncomfortably when Erin's voice rose. Bella sat nearby, quiet, clutching a book in her lap. She turned a bookmark slowly between her fingers, the same one she had once slipped into my suitcase. When Erin demanded to know if Travis was going to let me smear their family name, he did not answer. He kept his eyes on the television, his silence deeper than agreement, but heavier than defiance. Erin slammed the remote onto the table, the batteries scattering across the floor. She stormed into the kitchen, slamming drawers, her anger rattling the walls. Travis remained still, his gaze locked on Bella. Their eyes met for only a moment, but something flickered in his expression, something that looked almost like doubt. The following week, I heard from Leanne that neighbors in Hartford had begun asking questions. Mrs. Carter, who had once repeated Erin's stories with a cold smile, now avoided her in the driveway. Others whispered about what they had seen on television, wondering if perhaps the version of me they had believed was not the truth after all. For Erin, the control she had wielded so carefully was slipping. She could not explain away what had been spoken publicly, what had been filmed and aired for all to see. Her anger grew, but the more she raged, the quieter Travis became. For the first time, his silence was not weapon, but fracture, a small crack between them. At the foundation, more women filled the chairs each week. Some brought friends, some carried notebooks of their own stories. The air in the shop buzzed with both grief and relief, as if we were all finally exhaling after holding our breath too long. I sat among them listening, guiding when needed, but mostly allowing their voices to rise. One evening, Angela looked at me across the circle and said plainly, "You started this. Do not forget that." I shook my head, telling her that we had all started it together. Yet in my chest I carried a quiet flame, one that grew brighter every time I saw a woman lift her eyes and realize she was not invisible. News traveled further than I expected. A local newspaper ran a short piece, then an online blog picked it up. Each time the phone rang, I braced myself for Erin's fury, but instead I heard voices of women I had never met asking if there was room for them. Back in Hartford, Erin's fury only deepened. But no matter how loud she grew, her words no longer carried the same power. The community had begun to see her differently. Travis, caught between his wife's rage and his daughter's quiet defiance, no longer rushed to defend Erin as he once had. His silence widened like a canyon between them, one Erin could not cross with scolding or demands. For me, it was not triumph I felt, but something steadier. Vindication. The world that had once believed Erin's whispers now heard my voice, and more importantly, the voices of countless women who had been silenced. The shame she had tried to plant in me had shifted back to her, visible in the way neighbors looked at her, in the way her control slipped through her fingers. I locked the shop one night, the air crisp with the scent of approaching snow. As I turned the key, I looked back through the window at the circle of chairs at the shelves, slowly filling again with donated books at the framed license on the wall. My reflection in the glass looked older than when I first opened this door decades ago, but also stronger. Inside me, the words echoed again. Tonight I take my power back. But this time, it was no longer just tonight. It was every day in every story spoken, in every silence broken. And for the first time, karma had shifted. Not as revenge, but as balance. The scales were no longer tipped against me. They were beginning to even. The winter melted into spring, and with it came more voices than I ever expected. The second chapter foundation grew from a handful of chairs in a dusty room to circles that filled every corner of the shop. Some women came quietly slipping through the door with downcast eyes. Others arrived determined, clutching folders of paperwork and questions. Each one carried a weight, and together those weights became something lighter shared across the room. Leanne kept the structure steady, guiding us through the legal steps of building something that could last. We created workshops on financial literacy, legal protection, even journaling sessions where women who had never written a word about themselves filled pages with truths that had been bottled for decades. The walls of the shop that once echoed with emptiness now carried laughter, tears, and the sound of voices discovering themselves again. One afternoon in late summer, as I sorted through a box of donated books, a small envelope appeared in the mail pile. My name was written in a child's handwriting, uneven letters that tugged at my chest before I even opened it. Inside was a stapled booklet of folded notebook paper. On the cover in blue ink were the words, Chapter 1.5. Below them, carefully penciled, she had written, I still believe you. I sat down at the counter and opened the first page. Bella's words were simple, broken into short lines like breaths. She wrote about the night she had seen me packing, how she had wanted to stop me, but did not know if she was allowed. She wrote about the silence in the house after I left, how her mother's voice filled the rooms, but the warmth was gone. She wrote about the bookmark she had made, how she had thought of me every time she opened a book for school. The last page held a drawing, a window with sunlight pouring through a figure standing with her back straight. Underneath, she had written only 5 words. I want to be different. Tears blurred the ink as I read. I pressed the booklet against my chest and let the sound of women's voices in the next room surround me. Bella's words were not just for me. They were a bridge between the silence she had witnessed and the voice she was beginning to find. Weeks later, the bell above the door chimed one quiet afternoon. I looked up expecting another visitor seeking help. Instead, Bella stood in the doorway, taller than I remembered, her hair pulled into a braid that had already come loose at the edges. She held something in her hand, a copy of her little booklet folded and worn. She walked toward me without hesitation. I rose from my chair, my hands trembling. When she reached me, she pressed the booklet into my palm, then wrapped her arms around me. Her hug was fierce, almost desperate, and I held her just as tightly. We did not speak. We did not need to. Everything was already written in the way she held on, in the way her small shoulders shook and then stilled against me. When we pulled apart, she glanced around the shop, her eyes wide, at the shelves filled again with books and the circle of chairs in the center. She touched the framed license on the wall, then looked back at me with a smile that was both child and something more, a smile that told me she understood more than anyone had given her credit for. We brewed tea in the back room and sat together while women arrived slowly for that evening's session. Bella watched them gather, her hands folded around her cup. She listened as Angela spoke, as Maria laughed through tears, as Unji shared an update about her new job at a bakery. I saw Bella's eyes widen, saw the way she leaned forward as if absorbing every word. Later, as the women left and the shop grew quiet again, Bella slipped the bookmark back into my hand. She had carried it all this time. "I believe you it still read." I placed it on the counter next to Alan's letter, letting the words rest side by side. Past and future husband and granddaughter both had given me the strength to keep going. That night I locked the door and turned off the lights, but I did not feel the silence as I once had. The shop pulsed with something living, something that belonged to all of us. I knew then that my story had never been only about revenge. It was about finding a way back to myself, about planting a seed so that others could see their own strength reflected. I touched Bella's booklet again before placing it in the drawer where I kept the most precious things. It was not just her words that moved me. It was the truth that she was already writing her second chapter, even at 11 years old. As I stood in the dim light of the street outside the shop, the cool air brushing my face, I felt a peace I had not known in years. My past would never vanish, but it no longer defined me. My voice was no longer silent, and neither were the voices of the women who walked through my door. If you have ever been made to feel invisible, if you have ever been told your story did not matter, I want you to know this. You have the right to write your own second chapter. You have the right to begin again no matter how many pages came before. And sometimes all it takes to start is a single word spoken aloud, a single step taken forward, or a single belief held close until you are ready to claim your voice.